I'm Jono Buchanan. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to learn about Reverb's pre-delay options. The idea that we can, well, actually, rather than do that, let's just play the track and then we'll get into the reverb stuff in just a second. Here is a pluck sound that couldn't be any drier if it tried. Okay, so what we've got is this quite kind of reverberant track. We've got a bass line, which is clearly in a kind of space of its own. We've got a pad, which is providing this kind of big cinema-y kind of width, if you like. And then we've got a pluck sound that feels so dry that it's right in front of our eyes. Now, elsewhere on the channel, in other videos, I've talked about the fact that adding reverb effectively changes the front to back sense of what our mix space is. If we think about sounds acoustically, if you are a long way away from a sound in a reverberant space like a cathedral, you hear lots of reverb and not a lot of dry signal. And as you walk towards that sound source, the dry signal, the direct sound that you get from the performer, increases in volume and the reverb drops. And as a result, what we get is a much drier sound. What we've got at the moment with this analog pluck sound is absolutely no reverb. And this sound will be transformed the moment I put a reverb on it. And I'm going to use Chromaverb for this example. And in fact, we're going to go with the room and I'm going to just turn up the decay time. And here is exactly the same track, but this time with some reverb. And of course, that is totally transformative for the production overall, the mix of it. The sound has a completely different role to play. But the interesting thing now is it's got this kind of dreamy, spacey quality to it, which is fine. But there was something kind of arresting about that original dry version too. Is there a way that we can kind of split the difference between the dry signal and the wet signal? Well, of course, there are a number of ways we can do that when we work with reverb plugins. So for a start, what I can do is to choose the balance between the dry level and the wet. So if I wanted more dry signal, I can just simply back the reverb down. And similarly, if I wanted less dry and only reverb, I could change those dials too. But there is also another way, which is the idea of working with pre-delay. Now, what this allows us to do is to create a gap between the dry signal and then the reverb, a hole in the mix after the dry sound happens before the reverb arrives. Now, actually, within Chromaverb, there are a couple of ways that we can do this. And that's because Chromaverb offers an attack time too. What this does is to soften the reverb start of the sounds that we're listening to. But what I want to do is to make sure that we understand this in the context of almost any reverb plugin you'll ever use. So I'm going to ignore this dial for a moment. Instead, I'm going to focus my attentions on pre-delay, because pre-delay is a parameter which is common to, well, I can't think of a reverb plugin that doesn't really provide a pre-delay now that I can just see the comments loading up on YouTube as you all post reverb plugins just to put me in my place, and so you should. Absolutely right, go ahead and do that if you want to. But the pre-delay is here, and what this does, as I say, is to provide this audio gap, this space, if you like, between the dry signal and the wet. And to really appreciate this, we're going to just solo this pluck sound for a second. So what I can do is to introduce pre-delay in milliseconds right here. And what I'm going to do is I play this sound back, is I'm going to increase this number. And that's going to insert the number of milliseconds between the dry sound and the wet sound happening. Hopefully you can hear the gap now. It's a second long. So we've got this incredible, huge sounding thing. And again, if we come back to 8 milliseconds, which is where we started, that's so fast, we don't hear the gap between the sound and the reverb being triggered. It just sounds like one thing. So effectively, think about it like this. There's that word again. Think about it like this. This sound has this amount of reverb. When we introduce pre-delay, we are decoupling those two things, the sound and then the reverb, two separate experiences. And that has quite a profound production effect at the mix stage. And that's particularly true if we decide to make the pre-delay in time with our track. Instead of using milliseconds, what I'm going to do instead is to click this little button here. And what this does is to provide me with the opportunity to synchronize the pre-delay to tempo. So if I select a 16th note here, what we're going to discover is that there is a 16th note or semi-quaver gap between the dry signal and then the reverb arriving. And in the mix, quite nice. So we get the kind of experience of the dry note before the reverb then arrives as this kind of answer phrase. Really interesting production technique. Okay, so that looks at pre-delay, and it's enough really for us to begin to experiment with reverb in different ways. However, we're not done. And the reason we're not done is I'm actually going to take this off and I'm going to take the pre-delay. Oh, look, that's quite interesting. So if I come out of sync mode, I get to discover how many milliseconds that is. That's quite nice. So if I decided I wanted to slightly smudge that and have a value that arrived a little bit early or late of whatever sort of quantized value I select here, I could just adjust this pre-delay to make things feel a little bit earlier or late. I'm going to come back to the original default of 8 milliseconds, which, as we know, is effectively providing no audible pre-delay at all. And what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to fire up a different processor after the reverb, and that is going to be step effects. I'm going to come to the multi-effects, and I'm going to come to step effects. And what I'm interested to do here straight away is to turn off any sense of filter cutoff change. I'm going to open the filter right up so it's just on, it's just happening. Don't want any resonance happening either. That's fine because I've turned this off. It's not going to be doing its thing, I don't think. No, okay, so that's just going to be a static level. And in fact, I'll turn resonance off. We don't need that to be happening either. What I'm interested to do, however, is to play around with the gate mix. Now, this is really a volume sort of control for a 16th note sequence. So what I can do if I take any sound and I put on a gate mix is I can chop a signal up into 16th note slices, and I can make those all the level that I want them to be, and they can either just sort of ramp up or they can ramp away, or they can do whatever I like. And normally we think about using a process like this to take sounds like pads or beat loops and to kind of chop them up into different volume slices. But remember, this gate mix is happening after the reverb. So it's the reverberant signal that we're about to turn into a multi-sliced thing. Okay, so the other thing to know about this kind of gate mix, this volume slicing, is that the shape of each of these individual slices is controlled here. This is the envelope shape for each of them. So there is currently a little fade in before it then fades out. Well, I want each of these to be a defined moment in itself. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change this shape so that it becomes much more of a attacking sound, which then decays over a period of time, and that's going to be controlled by the release value, and we're going to come back to that in a little while. So now think about each of these slices as something which speaks immediately and then fades out before the next one happens. Hopefully that makes sense. Now the next thing to say, I'm just going to reset this pattern, is that my little pluck sound is actually happening on the third 16th note of each bar. So again, let's just solo it for a second. And what we'll see, we might be able to see it. It might not be that they completely tally when I press play, but think about it like this. The first sound, the pluck sound itself, is happening on the third step of this sequence. If that note was on the downbeat, it would be happening on the first one, but it's not the first or the second, it's the third 16th note of each bar every time it plays. Now remember, we're hearing it as this series of chopped slices because the volume is being chopped up by this envelope shape. If I make the release time shorter, that will be more extreme. And if I make it longer, so if I make the release time as long as it can be, and I make the curve of that shape as proud as it can be, in other words, the volume stays as loud as it can for longer, we almost don't hear the gating at all. So that parameter alone is quite an interesting one in terms of understanding the shape that we're working on. Okay, so as we know, it's the third slice that's happening. So or at least the third slice that is the first active moment where the note happens. So if what I wanted to do was to kind of almost gate an idea of pre-delay, in other words, I wanted the note to happen in a dry space and then for the reverb to creep up after it. That would mean that I needed to drop the volume on the third slice so that that note had the potential to be dry, and then for the volume to kind of creep up after that over the following steps until it reached maximum volume. And that could look something like that, I guess. And then it would stay loud, including for these final two steps before the note happened again. Now, of course, it would have been easier if I put those notes on the downbeat, but we're not about easy on this channel. No, no, no. Okay, so effectively think about it like we've got this little offbeat step and that's what's happening. But when I press play, I don't think we're going to quite get the effect that I've described. That's going to be disappointing, isn't it? Why is that? Why aren't we hearing the dry sound before the reverb happens? Are you shouting the answer at the screen? I do hope so. Remember, at the moment, the mix level is 100% wet. So what that means is that we are processing all of only the wet signal which is coming out of Chromaverb. So if I back the mix level down, we're going to get more of the dry signal because we're not only applying this processing to this sound. Well, that's more effective, but if we really want that, what I need to do is to move two of these effects across to an auxiliary. Now then, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to explain why that's going to be more effective. If I want the dry signal, I need this channel, the original analog pluck sound, to provide the potential for this sound to be completely dry. And then I need the auxiliary to provide the potential for it to be completely wet. In other words, just to be processing the wet signal. At the moment, because the Chromaverb is in channel, the balance between the dry signal and the wet signal is set by these dials. The signal can't only be 100% dry because it means I'll get no reverb. And it can't only be 100% wet because I won't get any of the dry signal. So what I need to do is this. I need to set up a new auxiliary channel. Let's choose bus 1, for it is the first one that's available. And then what I'm going to do is to send the amount of level I want to have go across here to unity gain. In other words, absolutely not being amplified, not being pushed in volume, but also not being attenuated either. And then what I'm going to do is to move Chromaverb over here, and I'm going to move step effects over here as well. And the advantage of that is it means I can come back to Chromaverb, I can drop the dry level, and I can put the wet level at 100%. And what that means is that now the dry signal is exclusively coming from this track. If I turn off the auxiliary, this sound will just be dry. There it is. And if I turn on the auxiliary, this channel is just providing reverb. And what that means is I can come back to step effects and I can turn the mix level up to 100%. And that means that we're now going to be applying all of the volume processing that we've drawn in through these steps to this Chromaverb effect. Fun, isn't it? Now, wouldn't it be great if we could automate that parameter? Okay, let's do it. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to come to the auxiliary track and we are going to create a track for it. And what we might do, just because we're having so much fun, is to double the length of the whole of the experience of this track so it can happen twice. So good, we've doubled its length. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to open up not the Chromaverb, no, but the step effects instead, and I'm going to come into latch mode. And now what I can do is to play around with a couple of parameters here. I'm going to play around with the release time, and I'm going to see whether or not this little shape, this shaping tool, is also an automatable parameter. We'll find out pretty quickly, because if I open up automation, it's going to be so disappointing if the answer is no, isn't it? Now that I've given it the big build up, if I press play, look at that, you can't automate that parameter. Surely this one though. Phew. Okay, so it's still sort of Christmas, it's just not the Christmas we planned for. Never mind. Okay, so now we can see the release time and its automation. Of course, we can go back and edit anything that we don't like. But what we've had a chance to do in this video is to effectively, I've used that word, I'm so sorry, I am taking tablets, but they just won't make any difference. We've looked at a way to be able to change the envelope shaping of reverb. This sense that what we can do is to introduce a kind of volume gating to the effects that we're putting into our mixes. And if all of this feels a bit unnecessary, go back to the video at the beginning and watch the whole concept of pre-delay again. This idea that we can build a gap between the dry signal and the reverb or the effect that follows it. And what that does is to decouple the effect from the dry signal. It gives us a different production angle, a different way of thinking about dry and wet signals. And all of those, hopefully, will give you other flavors to play with when it comes to mixing your tracks.